Final Fantasy has always been my favourite video game series of all time. I want to put this list together as a way to not only dive into the world of top 10s on the channel, but also in honour of how important the series actually is to me. I am only going to be including mainline entries, so games such as Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles won't be included, and I'm also not going to be including the MMOs Final Fantasy XIV and XI. Please be aware that there's going to be some minor spoilers. I have done my absolute best to limit those as much as possible, except possibly the last two on the list. Anyway, enough of that, let's dive straight in with number 10. I've always had a bit of a love-hate relationship with Final Fantasy XII. I guess it's because it's the first time the series didn't include the stationary turn-based combat system, and I really do love old-school RPGs. Being said, it's still a very good entry to the series, and there's more than enough strategy involved in the battles that I was able to see through what I'd initially disliked with the changes that were made. Not only that, I had a fantastic time with the hunts, and there was plenty to explore. I'd say that the Zodiac Age on PS4 is probably my favourite way to play through. I really enjoyed experimenting with the different class variations, even though it possibly did make me slightly anxious that once I chose the class there was no going back. So in my opinion, although I find the plot line, a bit like its main character Vaan, somewhat forgettable, it's still a decent entry, and you know, let's face it, Balthier's the main character of this game anyway. So you really are going to need to love those old school JRPG graphics and gameplay mechanics to get through number 9 on the list. I have so many good things to say about the original NES Final Fantasy, but at the same time, you have to put so many hours of mindless grinding in if you want to see the ending. The story, as to be expected, is very simple, but I guess there's still a certain charm to it, and the music scores, they are so good for its time. I can't fault the feeling of nostalgia I get whenever I hear pieces like the game's intro or battle theme. I do think though that there's better ways of playing Final Fantasy I. Maybe consider checking out Final Fantasy Dawn of Souls for the Game Boy Advance or the PSP remake. They're both absolute bangers. And let's see how the Pixel Collection fares when it releases later this year. So my entry at number 8 is one that I really ought to play through again. It is quite possible that looking back at Final Fantasy XIII, I am actually seeing the game somewhat through nostalgic starry eyes. I remember being astonished at the quality of graphics and the music, especially as legendary composer Nobuo Uematsu wasn't involved. It's safe to say that I was in absolute awe back in 2010, but does that still hold up today? Maybe, maybe not. I'm going to hold off from replaying the PS3 version again though, as I'm actually kind of expecting a 13 trilogy remaster at some point soon, fingers crossed. For me, 13 was a great game, and I'll be snatching up a remaster if they ever do release one. And you never know, they might even edit a smile on Lightning's face. So 13-2 tops the first game in the 13 trilogy in so many ways, mainly because the exploration had opened up massively, and the combat felt much more in depth. Remember there being a little bit of a Pokemon vibe going on there as well. I felt a larger connection to the characters, albeit there was a much smaller cast of main characters in the original game, and the music score was nothing less than utterly epic. It was an absolutely fantastic score. The story feels much more light-hearted, but does still build up to a fantastic climax. I think 13-2 is easily the best in the 13 trilogy by far, so yeah, the gorgeous non-linear 13-2 takes 7th place. Final Fantasy VI is one of the most epic old school games I'd ever experienced at the point when I first played it. And yes guys, games, not even role-playing games. I think there's few that nail the 16-bit era of RPGs quite like 6 does. The story was insanely good and definitely takes you on one hell of a ride. My reason for it not being further up the list is simply because apart from Terra and possibly Celes, hopefully I've said that right, I never felt too much of a connection with the massive cast of characters, as for me there was just too many of them. Kefka was definitely a great antagonist though, and although I'm not part of the he's stronger than Sephiroth group, he's definitely much more evil. Final Fantasy VI is brilliant and I regularly go back to it. Yep, I know most people are going to think I'm absolutely crazy, but Final Fantasy IV does sit above Final Fantasy VI on my top 10 list. I think the evolution of Cecil is an absolutely amazing piece of storytelling for its time. I think Rydia's story and the relationship between Rosa and Cecil are both great. Kain is easily one of my favourite Final Fantasy characters of all time. He's so cool and his story arc's utterly awesome too. I think 4's the first time the series really succeeded at telling an amazing story. Now 6 definitely built upon the successes of Final Fantasy IV and made a lot of positive changes too, but the story of the Dark Knight and the evil Golbez just seems to stick with me that bit more. Right then guys, as a quick side note, I am now talking about 4 of my favourite video games of all time, and it was very difficult to put these in any kind of order, especially the last 2. I think it needs to be said also that I really couldn't imagine a world where these 4 games didn't exist. I play them regularly and I will do for the rest of my life. Anyway, spoilers incoming, here we go at number 4. I remember receiving Final Fantasy VIII for my 11th birthday. I was so desperate to get my hands on it. I did everything to see if my dad had actually brought it for me, kind of in fear that maybe he'd made a mistake and got me something else instead. In February that year though, I did get it and I was not disappointed at all. I thought at the time Squall was one of the coolest guys I'd ever seen and would have done literally anything to get my hands on my own gunblade. I couldn't have cared less that I didn't have a clue what I was doing. Regarding the confusing combat and levelling system, guys, I levelled up as much as possible, not knowing what I was doing, and loved every minute of it. I recently played the PS4 remaster and I think it still holds up great. I am aware these days though of its flaws, mainly being the rushed second act and overly emo main character, but I still think Final Fantasy VIII is one of my favourite games of all time, despite all its quirks. So when I was younger, I had what some people may consider to be a very strained relationship with certain family members due to a difference in religious beliefs, and it did take its toll on me quite a bit as a young kid because I was happy just being me and not wanting to go to church. That was my choice. Final Fantasy X really hits home for me here because I completely resonated with Tidus and how he doesn't understand the world around him. I felt as though I was playing as a character that I completely understood, as he was an outsider to the world he found himself in and a complete alien to the faith that the people of the world believe in. The game's bright setting, the relationship between Tidus and his dad Jecht, and the pilgrimage that Yuna goes on are just a few reasons why Final Fantasy X will always be one of the best stories to have ever come out of a Final Fantasy game in my opinion. I still consider the fresh turn-based combat that involves every playable character one of the best in the series, and I'm not sure there's one piece of music that isn't just absolutely epic. For me, it was the perfect send-off to the turn-based generation of mainline Final Fantasy games. So it's worth noting that I struggled horrendously with my placement for the last 2 games on this list. I've changed my mind about 20 times since deciding on where each should sit, but I have come to a decision, as hard as it was. And as much as I'll keep changing my mind, this is it. These are my top 2 Final Fantasy games. I've always been a huge fan of traditional fantasy storytelling such as The Lord of the Rings, and when Final Fantasy IX came out, it was the first time I'd ever played a Final Fantasy game that was set in a traditional fantasy setting, and I instantly fell in love with every single character I could meet and was 100% absorbed in the whole world. I wanted to see and do everything IX had to offer. Environments felt completely fresh and alive. I felt happy being in the company of all the characters and knew that if I could see life the same way as Zidane does, then you know what, that'd do for me. The story, the battle system, the music score and all the characters are all perfect in my opinion, and the words spoken by Vivi at the end of the game have left nothing short of the deepest impression on me. It's something that I'll never forget. To quote this, "Everyone, thank you, farewell, my memories will always be part of the sky." The perfect way to end a perfect Final Fantasy game. So with that, I imagine everyone must be able to guess what the last entry is by this point. And yep, you guessed it. The game that introduced me to my love of gaming, to RPGs and to in-depth storytelling in video games unlike anything I'd seen up until this point. It will always be, for me, the greatest video game ever made, Final Fantasy VII. And you know, the story of Cloud, Sephiroth, Tifa and Ares needs no explanation in 2023. I was sitting watching my friend battle through the first reactor sequence back in what I assume was 1998, and I knew that I needed to play 7 for myself. Once I'd got it, I'd spent every hour possible playing through the game with a party of Cloud, Tifa and Ares. I battled, I levelled, I conquered, we fled Midgar and was in awe of the massive world that had opened up once we'd left the city. I wasn't disappointed in any way, shape or form. I fell completely in love with Ares, as most of us did back then, and we chased down the evil Sephiroth and wanted to end this unhealthy obsession he had with his mum, Genova. We partied at the Gold Saucer, sorted out Barrett's issues with his mate, and travelled what was, for me, the most epic RPG world I'd ever travelled, gathering party members, building bonds with characters I literally loved the moment we met. Life was so good, it was amazing, perfect even, until this happens. Final Fantasy VII, my favourite game of all time.